Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take a look at some more HTML elements. Specifically, we are going to take a look at types of elements that I'm going to deem intermediate HTML. Now, that description is kind of arbitrary, and you'll see in this video that I'm actually not going to do much in the way of actual coding. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a type of element, or rather types of elements, and I'm going to pull some examples together in hopes for you to understand sort of the difference between the basic HTML that we've covered in the earlier videos and what I am calling this intermediate HTML. And again, in this video, we're not going to do much in the way of examples. I'm going to save those for later videos. I'm actually going to go through several of these elements in separate videos. But instead, what I want to do is I want to just touch on a couple of the pages here in the W3 Schools. And again, you can use the W3 Schools. You can use the Mozilla Developer Network pages as well. It doesn't really matter. This just happens to provide nice graphic, nice basis for the discussion. And specifically, what we want to do is we want to look at what we've already covered. So in the earlier videos, we covered tags, for instance, like the p tags or the header tags that would allow for you to encapsulate some text for the purposes of displaying or rendering it in the browser. And then, as I emphasized in the earlier videos, you would apply then a style to it using your cascading style sheets. Whether you did it inline or in the top of the document or in a second document isn't really that important in the context of this video. But the thing to remember is that those were fairly primitive elements. In other words, you could use them without necessarily a lot of sophistication or just essentially just basic HTML that you could use to quickly put together a nice looking page. Instead, in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to focus a little more on some of these structural elements. And again, be careful. You want to separate the structure from the style. And as part of a little nuanced piece of this discussion is this discussion of semantic elements and what are they? Now, I've mentioned them in earlier videos already, but I thought I'd take a little bit deeper of a dive into them before we got into the details of how some of these elements behave. So again, we're going to take a look at what are the HTML semantic elements. And so we'll start off with what is a non-semantic element. Well, a non-semantic element is just an element that doesn't really tell you what's inside of the element. In other words, it doesn't tell you what the element is. It's sort of generic. And so a couple of examples of that would be this div tag and the span tag. And you've seen those if you've ever looked at the code, the HTML code behind, for instance, Wikipedia. Wikipedia uses these two elements quite a bit. And in a later video, I'll explain how we can actually leverage these div tags and these span tags, or rather these div elements and these span elements, to tremendous advantage. But instead, let's talk a little bit about the semantic elements. And so the semantic elements, some of the examples that we have here are the IMG, which is the image tag, the table tag, and the article tags. They more clearly identify its content. Now, I want to hesitate to say clearly identify its content. I'm not disagreeing with what we have here on the page. However, though, I would argue that there is a lot of ambiguity in all of this. And if anything, what we want to do is we want to sort of emphasize that ambiguity. And so let's take a look at some of the other semantic elements, and then we're going to take a step back, and then we'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do with these. And so you can see here that some of these semantic elements essentially have a strongly implied meaning or purpose in the page. And that's the way that I'm going to leave it. Again, you sort of use the understanding or appreciation that you get from it through practice. But in some cases, like for instance, the header element, it's pretty clear. It's implied that it's supposed to be at the top of the page. The navigation element, again, top of the page, what's the purpose behind it? It's for navigation. Likewise with the footer element. Those are pretty clear. In other words, those are traditional. If anything, they kind of go back to old print type newspapers and so on. And that's where a lot of the HTML terminology actually comes from, is fundamentally from typesetting and layout design. But then you get into some of these other more ambiguously named elements, such as section and article. And again, don't worry, we're not going to dig too deep into it in this particular video, but the idea is that you don't necessarily know exactly what is in each of these, but they imply that there's a section of information, a section of the page. An article, if you think back again to a newspaper or magazine, sort of implies that it's a self-contained body of text or information. And so again, that's where we are referring to these semantic elements. Now, again, I have slightly different twist on this. You'll actually see that in a later video where I show you how to parse HTML using regular expressions. And that is sort of why I think of this in slightly different terms than what most folks do with the semantic elements. I'm hopefully going to convey that to you in later videos when we start looking at how to parse things like the div tag and the span tags. In a way to essentially scrape content off of an HTML page and use those tags or those elements to our advantage. Now, again, the purpose of this is to sort of structure the document, not necessarily to style the document, although it's going to be very hard to sort of decouple those because, again, the structure sort of leads to a style. But the idea is that the CSS or the cascading style sheets will help you with the color, the background color, the text font color, and so on. But the other elements then that I want to take a quick look at are going to be the div tag, as I mentioned. And you can see here that the div tag is simply used to surround a piece of text. And you can notice here, and again, we're going to talk about it in a later video, that it doesn't really do anything to the text. And again, where am I going with this? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to combine some of these semantic and some of these non-semantic elements into, or rather using the attributes such as the class attribute and also the ID to help us later on style and also control the behavior of some of our elements. So the reason why I'm calling this group of videos sort of a little more intermediate HTML is that it's sort of layering some of the topics on top of each other, but then also sort of digging a little bit deeper into the structure and how you can end up creating some pretty sophisticated pages. And then one of the last elements that I would like for us to look at in later videos is going to be the idea of this frame, this iframe. And what it is it's simply an inline frame that will allow for you to simply embed an entire HTML page within your own HTML page. And again, the purpose behind this introduction video isn't to sort of give you a comprehensive view of this, but to sort of help you think now, all right, we've got these basic tags, these basic elements that we've used. How can we now stack and layer these on top of each other to start creating some pretty sophisticated layouts? Again, focus on the structure right now. We'll come back with the style in a later video. But for right now, you want to be thinking of how can you create these more sophisticated structures in your page. And then the last link that I want to take a quick look at sort of encapsulates everything we just talked about in this video. And there's sort of some of these techniques, if you would, some of these styles that we're going to be taking a look at. And when I'm referring to styles, again, I'm not talking about cascading style sheets. I'm talking more about how do you want your page to be laid out structurally. There's sort of some rules of thumb. And again, a lot of it goes back to newspapers, magazines, books. However, you do have to also consider the mechanism in which your user is going to be viewing your page. In other words, are they going to be on their phone? Are they going to be on a tablet? Are they going to be on a desktop browser? Are you expecting the page to be viewed in landscape or portrait mode? And again, in later videos, we'll talk about how we can change all of that. But this link right here on the W3 Schools page sort of gives you some ideas. Again, you can see the basic HTML layout elements, same ones that we saw just a few minutes ago, and sort of gives you some idea of where to get started with a more sophisticated layout. Now, that's about all I've got for this video. Again, we'll talk about the specific elements in later videos. I'm actually only going to focus on a few of the elements instead of all of them, because there's a few, like for instance, the aside that, well, you can use it. I definitely don't have anything against it, but you're just going to probably find yourself a little less likely to be using that element. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on some of the more obvious ones. the header, the navigation, and then the footer. And specifically, I'd also like for us to take a look at the section and the article, although we'll probably hold off on some of those till we can really get an appreciation for how we can leverage our classes in our div tags for the purposes of really styling our page. And then we're going to come back and revisit some of these other elements. So hopefully you found this overview video useful. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.